FAQ psychoanalysis. We come to the third chapter, Carl Jung. Last time we finished chapter 2, which was on Sigmund Freud. Let's start with the basics and then get into the concepts of Carl Jung. Question 1. Who was Carl Jung? Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and a disciple of Sigmund Freud, who later on created his own school of psychoanalysis. Initially, he was a great admirer of Freud, a student of Freud, a disciple of Freud, then parted ways and created a school quite independent of Freud, in many ways opposed to some of the things that Freud said. So an initial admirer of Freud, later critique of Freud, Carl Jung is among one of the most open, most holistic of psychoanalytic founders of schools. One great characteristic which he shared with Freud was the capability to create a model of the mind. After Freud and Jung, we had very few psychoanalytic thinkers who could create a model of the mind. Melanie Klein could not create a model of the mind. Winnicott could not. Kohut could not. Navanlu could not. Erik Erikson also could not. Although Erik Erikson gave a program of life, stages of life, he could not create a very deep and convincing model of the mind. Unfortunately, after Jung, we did not have thinkers of that caliber who could go into one of the most difficult areas of psychoanalysis, creating the model of the mind and explaining one's school and one's concepts related to the working of the mind, pathogenesis, and healing based upon one's own model of the mind. Jung therefore stands out along with Freud, who created not only a school of psychoanalysis, but a school which has a model of the mind. Question 2. What is his contribution to psychoanalysis? Jung created a new school of psychoanalysis, the Jungian school, today referred to as the School of Analytical Psychology or the Analytical School. He gave a new model of the mind. He brought in a very important concept of the collective unconscious and very important concept of the archetypes. He also gave a new method of dream interpretation, which is very different from that of Sigmund Freud. He also brought in changes in the technique. Jungian technique of doing therapy is very different from Freudian technique of doing therapy. What the differences are, we will explore as we go along in this chapter. Question 3. What are his major works? Jung wrote extensively. He was a great writer, a prolific writer, but not a lucid writer. He is not easy to read. He is not a very structured person in expression. So he is not the best person to read on himself. Some of his major works I have listed out. Man and His Symbols, Memoirs, Dreams, Reflections, which runs into many volumes. Journal recordings, the Blue Book and the Red Book, both of which are now available. Or why did Jung separate from Freud? Jung and Freud had a very interesting and eventful relationship, and why they came together, why they worked together, and why they separated has always been a issue of great interest, great fascination, something enigmatic and something very relishable, very tasty. Some of the reasons why Jung separated from Freud were as this. First, Jung did not see sexuality, especially unconscious sexual complexes and especially the Oedipus complex, to be as important as Freud saw it. For Freud, unconscious sexual complexes, especially the Oedipus complex, was very important for pathogenesis. For Jung, sexuality was one of the many aspects of human nature, and therefore, while he agreed that some people may have a pathogenesis determined by unconscious sexuality, he did not agree with universality of the Oedipus complex or the significance of Oedipus complex in psychopathology. Second, Freud thought of psychic energy essentially as erotic energy, libido, whereas Jung thought of psychic energy as a neutral life energy, which could become erotic energy or aggressive energy or any other form of energy. It's like a bucket of water and you put 2 drops of color and the whole bucket becomes of that color. So that bucket of water is like the life energy, and at different points in the system or at different times, based upon what 2 drops of color are put into it, the life energy becomes that kind of energy. But essentially, it's a neutral life energy. So his idea of psychic energy in its most fundamental sense was that of a neutral life energy, whereas Freud thought of psychic energy in the most fundamental way as being erotic energy, the libido. Third difference, philosophically, the two were very different. Freud was a product of modernity, and he believed in the fundamental pillars of modernity in philosophical terms. So Freud's philosophical belief was in materialism, atheism, individualism, hedonism, and empirical science, laboratory science. The 5 pillars of modernity. Jung, to some extent, was a product of modernity. It was not that he was completely untouched by the constraints and the flavor of his time, but he was a semi-modernist. Jung saw great value in pre-modern and ancient knowledge, wisdom, mythology, customs, practices, which Freud did not see. So Freud was a complete modernist. Jung was a semi-modernist and a semi-holistic thinker. Fourth, both of them differed on the interpretation of dreams, how to do it. Jung did not agree with Freud on many aspects of dream interpretation. First, Jung did not agree that every dream needs to be interpreted. He felt some of the dreams were self-explanatory. So dream work was not universal in all the dreams. Unlike Freud, who believed that every dream essentially is a coded output of the unconscious and we have to decode it by a process of dream interpretation, which is the reverse of dream work, to arrive at the latent content or the true meaning of the dream in the unconscious. Third, Jung believed that many of the dreams was, sorry, fourth, Jung believed that many of the dreams were dreams of prophecy, dreams of problem solving, which Freud did not agree. Lastly, Jung interpreted the dreams in layers. So there was an individual interpretation, a cultural interpretation, a social interpretation, and finally, most importantly, an archetypal interpretation. And Jung felt that because his model of the mind and his view of human nature and human life was based upon the fundamental idea of a program of life, and the program of life was governed by archetypes situated in the collective unconscious, and the archetypes being coordinated by the self, the activation and deactivation of the archetype being coordinated by the self, and the pathology largely being a frustration of expression of the archetypal content. So for Jung, the fundamental point in pathology was frustration of the program of life. And this program of life was both species generic as well as specific to the individual. Freud did not believe in any of this. So for him, the essential concept of dream interpretation was to find out what were the repressed sexual desires or fears, or aggressive desires or fears, or envious desires or fears, but something to do with negative affect. There was a operating philosophy difference also between the two. As a person, Jung was essentially teleological in orientation. He was more concerned with goals, whereas Freud was more ontological in his orientation. He was more concerned with the origins. So Freud would traditionally look backwards to find the source of pathology, and Jung would traditionally look ahead to look at the goal which was being frustrated. Lastly, they were products of very different environments. Freud was brought up in a city environment, an empirical environment, a materialistic, atheistic environment. Jung was brought up in an environment full of belief, mysticism, and magic. Jung was largely a believer in the search of the sacred, whereas Freud was largely a believer in the search of a material root, an atomic root, so to say, of the entire human mind. Lastly, this is the real lastly, Jung was more of a person who would live rather than just reflect. Freud was a person who would more reflect rather than live. And all these differences between the two people ultimately led to separation of Jung and Freud. 5. What is Jung's model of the mind? Jung's model of the mind is this. You can see on the screen. At the center of Jung's model of the mind is the self. This self is very near to the Hindu idea of the soul. the soul which evolves. The only difference being, Jung did not go into reincarnation while creating his model of the mind. There he was a person who was constrained by modernity. So Jung's self evolves, but only in one lifetime. Whereas the Hindu self or the Hindu soul evolves lifetime to lifetime. This self coordinates the working of the collective unconscious. This collective unconscious is a layer just outside of the self. This collective unconscious has three elements. One, an individual program of life based upon the archetypes. Archetypes are those typal entities whose reflection we find in society in the outer world. So if we look into society, we find some social roles which are stable across the human civilization. These roles, which are present in all societies, even the tribal societies, who have not been in touch with civilization, these archetypes are the magician, the soldier, the warrior, the poet, the healer, the old wise man. You also see biologically determined and psychologically significant, a two-sided entity, the masculinity, animus, the femininity, anima, the mother, father, child, sibling, friend, teacher, king, queen. These are also archetypal entities. So we can look at archetypes as two layers of archetypes. Archetypes which are biologically determined, like the child, the infant, the child, the prince, the teenage prince, the adult prince, the king, the hunter, the father, the advisor, the old wise man. So these are biologically determined archetypes that, regardless of society, by our very genetic structure, we have to pass through these stages, and appropriate to each stage is a set of beliefs, behaviors, experiences we undergo, and a role we play, a very archetypal role biologically determined. So when we look at archetypes, there are biologically determined archetypes, like everybody is going to be an infant, a child, a teenager prince, a young prince, the hunter, the king, the warrior, the the biological determined would be the infant, the child, the teenage prince, the young prince, the hunter, the father, the advisor, the old wise man. These would be naturally determined. Then you have socially created archetypes, which have been historically there for a very long time, which partly are the products of our own imagination, our own collective unconscious, which uses fundamental entities like imagination, hope, desire for pleasure to create archetypal images, which are unique to our species. These images are the images of the king, the queen, the magician, the healer, which are based, all these are based partly upon our mythological strivings, our imaginative strivings, our archetypal strivings, and partly based upon the necessities of specialization in the outer world. So these are social archetypes. So we can look at archetypes at two levels, the biological archetypes and the social archetypes. And our behavior at any given particular point in time is based upon activation or deactivation of archetypes done by the self. So when one reaches the stage of a child from an infant, the child archetype activates, and special behaviors which are very cute and coy, they come up in the child. And that coming up is governed by the self activating the child archetype. So the collective unconscious has archetypes, biological and social. And the third layer is archetypes which we learn after birth from the culture. So the third layer is the cultural layer of archetypes. This cultural layer comes partly from tradition, partly from communication from other cultures. So you can visualize the archetype building as a three-story building. Ground floor, first floor, second floor. Biological archetypes, social archetypes, cultural archetypes. The first two, ground floor and the first floor, are largely eternal. Eternal, not eternal in the sense of eternal, but over civilized history, they are largely constant. Whereas the top layer is more a product of the spirit of the times and what is communicated to us. Function of times we live in and what teaching, learning we have undergone. This collective unconscious, apart from archetypes, also has some memories, certain predispositions to do's and don'ts, certain memories of our evolutionary past. So the learning from evolutionary past also is there in this collective unconscious. Those who are interested in mysticism, they also talk about some occult practices which involve some entities in the collective unconscious inside and then some entities outside, and the two together coming to interact in some special way to help undertake an occult process. That I would leave to those who are more interested in the occult. So we have the self at the center and then the collective unconscious, which has learnings from evolutionary past as well as the archetypes. Outside of the collective unconscious is the personal unconscious. For Freud, this was the only part of the unconscious. Freud did not believe that the self exists or the collective unconscious exists. For Freud, it was just this personal unconscious which was existing. In one sense, therefore, Freud is more of an individualist, whereas Jung is more of a transpersonal psychologist, because these things are not personal, they are transpersonal. The idea of the self and idea of the collective unconscious is a transpersonal idea. Collective unconscious definitely is a transpersonal idea. Self we can view in both ways. If we connect the self to a larger flow of history, it becomes transpersonal. If we keep self only as an individual entity which is born and it will just go away when the individual dies, and is not connected to the larger whole, then self becomes a personal entity, not a transpersonal entity. But most people believe self has some sort of a transpersonal element to it. There's some connection to the whole. The personal unconscious is based upon the repressed content of personal experience. And then we have the conscious. Jung does not talk of a pre-conscious like Freud. Freud talks about a pre-conscious. Jung does not talk about the pre-conscious. The pre-conscious is subsumed in the conscious. And in the conscious is the ego. The ego is linked to the self by what is called ego-self axis. Very important in Jungian model of the mind and Jungian therapy. If this is strong, the health is better. If this is weak, psychological problems are likely. So one of the core elements of Jungian therapy is to strengthen the ego-self axis, which is to say, make the ego understand, accept, and incorporate the self as far as possible and not be swayed away with inputs from the environment. Because the ego on one hand is in touch with the self. On the other hand, the ego is in touch with the environment outside. So if the ego is too much in the influence of the environment and too little of the self, it creates trouble. So there has to be a balance of being under the influence of self and the environment, and the balance has to be skewed towards the self. It has to be a 70-30 kind of balance or a 60-40 kind of balance. 60% or 70% self, 30% or 40% the environment. If it turns the other way, we are in trouble. So this is Jung's model of the mind, which I have taken from Anthony Stevens' book. All credits to him. There is a separate conceptualization also of Jung's model of the mind. Some people believe that Jung wrote, and he did write at some places, that the self is not only at the center, but is all around the psyche. So the self is actually around, covering the psyche everywhere. In that conceptualization of the self, this self becomes outermost layer. But this model of the mind I find more accurate, more meaningful than the other model of the mind. What one can think of is this self connected to some higher layer of intelligence and purpose which is driving human history. And through that, the individual gets connected to the flow of human history. So this self then becomes connected to some layer of a larger self, the self of everyone, which is more like a Hindu idea of the Brahman. Not the passive Brahman, but the active part of the Brahman. Sixth, what is collective unconscious? Jung's unconscious had two layers, the personal unconscious and below that the collective unconscious. So collective unconscious is not unique to the individual. It is unique to the species, but it individualizes itself. For example, we all have fingerprints, which is common to the species, but all of us have unique fingerprints. So it is common as well as unique at the same time. We all have two eyes, but our iris is different. So it is common yet unique. So similarly, archetypes are common yet unique. So how much of how strong a warrior archetype will I have? How strong the hero archetype will I have? The relative strength of the two will differ from person to person. Exactly at what time this has to be activated, deactivated, to what extent will differ from person to person. So everyone will experience childhood, everyone will experience youth, but they will experience it differently. The idea of collective unconscious came from many different sources. The way Jung started conceptualizing was he saw in utterances of the psychotic many elements which are common across the world in terms of the mythology. Even in tribal cultures, the mythology has certain elements which are common to our mythology, which means that that content is coming not from outside but from inside. By virtue of what we are as a species, we are predisposed, almost commanded from inside to create mythology of a particular time. And this cannot be coming from outside, from behavioral experience. This has to be coming from inside, from something innate, some layer of the mind which we inherit by birth. And that is one input why Jung was led to the idea of the collective unconscious. Second was commonality in art. That across the world we see commonality in literature and art in a generic sense, and that cannot just be a coincidence. It has to be because of something common in terms of a deeper layer of the mind. Third, you could not agree that human life was purposeless without a structure. And he saw age-appropriate structures, age-appropriate psychic behavior at work. And therefore, to him, the program of life was very apparent. And once we talk about program of life, there has to be something inside that governs that program of life. And you have to find a intrapsychic structural layer to be responsible for determining the program of life which you see outside. So if program of life is seen outside, inevitably we are drawn to finding what is the structural base that governs this program of life. And that is a third idea for the archetypal, for the collective unconscious. The fourth was the analysis of dreams of people who would come to Jung. They often displayed very intense, vivid mythological elements. So, not only mythological elements, even evolutionary elements. So all of this led Jung to conceptualize that there must be a layer of the mind from where all of this is coming. The myths, the age-appropriate fantasies which are clothed in terms of very archetypal social roles, and fantasies which are based upon the evolutionary learning of the race. And therefore, he conceptualized of a collective unconscious, which was a layer of the mind deeper than the personal unconscious, and which in fact was in some way very important in determining the contents of the personal unconscious. And this is named as the collective unconscious. And the core element in the collective unconscious were those that were determining the program of life. And he called them archetypes. And this brings us to archetypes. Question 7. What are archetypes? These are active entities in the collective unconscious, very different from Platonic ideas. Platonic ideas are also suprahuman. They are also transpersonal. But they are transcendental. They are not innate, involved in evolution. Whereas Jung's archetypes are evolved in evolution in personal life, and they seek their fulfillment. So they are highly charged with motivation. Unlike Platonic ideas, which are largely stoic, Jung's archetypes are not stoic. They are toned with motivation of self-actualization. The archetypes can be divided into three: the biological archetypes, the social archetypes, and the cultural archetypes. The biological archetypes are the archetypes of the anima, the animus, the child, the teenager, the prince, the young prince, the hunter, the father or the mother, the advisor, the old wise man. Culturally, the social archetypes can be the magician, the saint, the teacher, the healer. There is in between to the social and the biologically determined archetypes. So you can actually put a layer there: the biological archetypes, the psychological archetypes, the social archetypes, and the cultural archetypes. The psychological archetypes include the persona and the shadow. And then you have the social archetypes, the saint, the teacher, the healer, and the cultural archetypes, the archetype of the Krishna, the archetype of the Kali, the archetype of the Holy Mother, or the archetype of Zorba or Apollo. So there would be a cultural archetype which would be unique to any culture. Social archetypes which are unique, they are common to by and large all cultures. Psychological archetypes and biologically determined archetypes. So you can look at it as a four-structured building, ground floor and the 3 floors. I initially said 3 structures, but I forgot the classification of the psychological archetypes. You can actually look at it as 4-structured building. But archetypes are different from Platonic ideas, although they share some commonality with the Platonic idea that they are generic at the same time individual. And if one conceives that in the Platonic realm, the archetypes are anchored, then it would lead to a different conceptualization, that every individual draws his proportion of archetype from an infinite layer inside the Platonic realm. So then you would have the Platonic represent the archetypes as entities in the Platonic realm, which are taken out of the Platonic realm into the individual. But as they are put into the individual, they get powered by motivations. And then they become seeking of their actualization. Very different from their stoic nature when they were in the Platonic realm. Eight, what is the persona and the shadow? Each of us shows a front to the society, which is called the persona, the frontal part of our personality. And then there are parts of our personality which you want to hide from the society. That is called the shadow. Occasionally, the shadow can become so dark that not only we wish to hide it from the society, we would wish to hide it even from ourselves. One of the primary goals of Jungian therapy is to put light on the shadow, explore the shadow, know what it is, feel the pain of having that shadow, and integrate that shadow into the conscious. In Jungian dream analysis, the shadow often comes up in the dream as a dark or a black figure. The persona and the shadow are not only social realities, they are also archetypal entities. And it's almost like the showroom and the godown. The persona is the showroom, and the messy godown is like the shadow. Ninth, what is anima and the animus? They are biological archetypes that determine our gender. Of course, both are present in everyone. Proportion is different. Anima would be stronger in women, animus in men. Anima is the feminine part, femininity in us. Animus is the masculinity in us. Like Freud, Jung also believed that both the masculine and feminine part are present in all of us. On this point, there was a complete agreement between the two that every person has a masculine part and a feminine part. Men in general have more of a masculine part, less of a feminine part, and the reverse for women. But anima and animus are both present, and we often have seen the symbol of yin and yang, the Chinese symbol of yin and yang, which actually is a derivative of even more ancient Hindu symbol of Shiva and Shakti, or Nar and Nareshwari. One of the goals of Jungian therapy, and this is the third goal we are talking about. First goal, we talked about strengthening the ego-self axis. Sorry for the break. I was talking about the goals of Jungian therapy. The first goal we listed out was strengthening of the ego self axis. Second goal is understanding the archetypal program of life, the frustration in its path, and working upon age appropriate activation and deactivation of archetypes. Third element is the integration of anima and animus. The fourth goal is the integration of shadow. And the fifth goal is finding an archetypally appropriate future program of life. All these goals essentially are larger goals of therapy and smaller goals of working through the split, the Oedipus, the envy, what other schools talks about. The other goals always are there. There is no denying the truth of other schools. It's just that in the Jungian approach, the governing arcade is Jungian, and the other schools are given secondary importance under that arcade. Unfortunately and very tragically, the end situation has become an odd situation, and many Jungians now think, talk, and do a or operation instead of an and operation. And the or operation is either you are a Jungian or you are a Clydian. Either you are a Jungian or you are a Freudian. And that partly is because of their fanaticism, their narrowness, and largely because of their limitation of knowledge. Unfortunately, in the Jungian training, the Freudian and the Clydian training is not given. And therefore, it becomes more of a Jungian school versus the other schools rather than Jungian school and the other schools. The real good approach for any school is to go for an and approach, have one school arcade as the overall integrator, overall conceptual governor, and on the way resolve issues which are talked about more deeply and more accurately in other schools. Because there is no question of denying the truth of any school. Every school is founded based upon clinical experience of hundreds of patients. And any school worth its salt which has endured more than 2 decades has some precious truths, inescapable, inevitable truths, which all other schools have to integrate in some way or the other. So, this is the or and the and situation. Is true in the whole of psychotherapy, equally true for the Jungian school. 10. What is individuation? For Jung, the purpose of life was individuation. The self was responsible for individuation, and the self would do it by activation and deactivation of suitable archetypes according to the program of life. Just as a seed contains the blueprint of the whole tree, the self contains the blueprint of our entire life. And if you bring in the element of karma, then this self would be under the influence of not only its unique nature and its unique quest for experiences, but also under the effect of karma. And once you accept the law of karma as influencing the self and also influencing from outside the activation and deactivation of archetypes, then astrology also comes into the Jungian scheme. Because once you accept the design of life, and then you accept the principle of karma, then astrology becomes inevitable. And some Jungians do use astrology to study how that forces, because then the law of karma would also act partly through the astrological realm. So then what we are looking at is the law of karma partly directly working through the self, partly directly through the archetypal through the collective unconscious, partly from the environment and partly through the astrological constellations. And then the activation and deactivation of archetypes and the working of the self would be affected by karma coming from all the four areas, directions. 11. What type of patients best benefit from Jungian therapy? Patients who are searching for a meaning in their lives, patients who are very close to nature and to arts, patients who are very artistically, imaginatively, mythologically driven, patients who are more goal-driven rather than origin-driven, patients who are not comfortable with the harshness and unpalatable truth of the Freudian or the Jungian or the Kleinian therapy. All these patients, they benefit out of Jungian therapy. Unfortunately, if Jungian therapy loses the anchor of psychoanalysis, says no to Freudian and Kleinian concepts altogether, and goes on the trip where it becomes difficult to separate psychotherapy from literature and reality from imagination, then Jungian therapy goes completely unanchored, without any foundation, without any roots. It's like a leaf in the wind. That is what, unfortunately, many Jungians have made out of Jungian therapy. However, for many who are more goal-oriented rather than origin-oriented, it's a very good approach which can provide an overall arcade and turn psychoanalytic concepts from other schools in this color and flavor and use them post that coloring and also flavoring. 12. What were the differences in approach of Freud and Jung? We have done this before. The model of the mind is different. Pathogenesis is different. Healing technique is different. Interpretation of dreams is different. The method is different. Significance of Oedipus is different. The way the therapy is done is very different. Freudian therapy is on the couch 5 days a week. If 5 days is not possible, minimum 3 days a week. Less than 3 days, it's not therapy at all. In Jungian therapy, it is not on the couch, it is face to face. Usually it is 2 days a week, maximum 3 days, in no case more than 3 days, unless it's an exception. And in Freudian therapy, it is always kept the same number of days per week. In the Jungian therapy, Jung usually used to taper it off and slowly reduce from 2 days to 1 day and taper it off. The belief of a collective unconscious in Jung not found in Freud. Freud was a materialist, Jung was more of an idealist. Freud was more of an atheist, Jung was more of a believer. Freud was more concerned with origins, Jung was more concerned with goals. Freud's interest was largely limited to psychoanalysis and medicine, especially neurology and biology. Jung went far into occult, religion, mythology, and tried to connect it to psychoanalysis. So, some of the differences between the two were this. And if you go deeper, say, how do you do dream analysis? Then in details, you find the differences. How is technique in Jungian therapy, Freudian therapy different? We discussed it. In Freud, it is on the couch 5 days, if not 5, at least 3. In Jung, it is face to face 2 to 3 days, tapered off over a period of time. How was Jung's approach to dream analysis different from Freud? Jung interpreted dreams at 3 levels: the personal context, the cultural context, the archetypal context. Freud never did that. Freud directly used the principles of dream interpretation to arrive at a latent content. Because Freud never believed in the archetypal issues and the archetypal entities and the collective unconscious, that level of interpretation never came up as relevant for him. Second, Freud believed wish fulfillment was very common in interpretation of dreams. Jung felt that it was not as common as Freud said. You can easily find dreams without any pathology. Third, Jung believed there existed dreams which needed no decoding. Rather, they needed a magnification. Whereas for Freud, every dream was a coded output of the unconscious which required decoding. Whereas for Jung, some dreams did not need decoding, some did. And not only some did not need decoding because they said what they wanted to say, some actually required magnification. And this is what is Jung's technique of active imagination, is magnification of the dream. Fifth, interpreting the elements of the dream. When it came to interpreting the elements of the dream, Freud took the classical route of using sexuality and aggression for interpreting the elements of the dream. For Jung, he used quite a bit of material from mythology, from culture, from spirituality, from one's actualization process to interpret the dream. So Jung's dreams are far less anchored in sexuality and aggression. And therefore, the language of interpreting the symbols is very different. 15. What is active imagination? Active imagination is a technique of dream analysis used in the Jungian approach, where the dreamer is asked to develop a part of a dream or take up one symbol and develop a new story around him, around that symbol. So it is developing the dream further, either by taking up one event or one entity out of the dream and consciously imagining further about it and creating a conscious dream around it. So it's development of a dream. It's like you take one small part of a dream, create a big dream out of it. It's like developing a story out of a seed idea. And Jung says that is what tells us more about the dream rather than going into the reductionist elementals of sexuality and aggression. We are midway, we can stop here for a break and then take up. We have finished till question 15. 16 to 30 we can take up in the next session. Second part of the chapter on Jung.